All right. Well, we are excited today to have Eric Hernandez with us. He works for Texas Baptist in the area of evangelism and apologetics. And so, Eric, we really are excited to have you with us today to talk about how we can engage students with the gospel and really help them have reasons for their faith in Christ. And so I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you share with us what you have for today, and then we'll ask some questions.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And to just jump right in, like I said, I'm the Apologetics Lead for Texas Baptist. And one thing I've noticed sometimes is oftentimes people either seem to have a misconception about apologetics, or perhaps don't realize that they engage in apologetics. And to just kind of jump in and get started, 1 Peter 3:15 is the verse that most people point to when talking about apologetics. And it basically says to be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you for the hope that is in you. In fact, it reads, set in your hearts, set Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks to give an account for the hope that is in you, but do this with gentleness and respect. That word, give an answer, is the Greek word apologia, which translates to defense. So apologetics is simply giving a defense for what we believe. So anytime you're articulating something about the faith, anytime you're explaining something, you are, in that sense, defending the view. And it doesn't necessarily encompass arguing or being argumentative. There's a difference between presenting an argument like a lawyer would in a court case versus being argumentative with someone. And we see this all throughout the Gospels. We see Christ engaging this, Paul engaging in this, Acts 17. You see these kind of things take place where there's dialogue. But before even jumping into any of that, I'm reminded of something Christ said. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, he says that you are the salt of the earth. And he says that if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? And that it's no longer good for anything. If we don't understand the context, sometimes we gloss over these kind of things, because obviously it's important to know that these things weren't written to a 21st century American society. So they were written to a group and culture that would have understood what he was saying, because the context and the time period would have been relative to the connotations behind the phrases and idioms he's using. Now, obviously back then, there were no refrigerators, so they would have no way to refrigerate meat. And what they would do is they would use salt, not just for seasoning, but more pertinently as a preservative. So salt was used as a way to preserve meat and to keep it from spoiling. So essentially what Christ is saying here is that if the salt loses its purpose, then it's not good for the thing it was intended to do. Now, biblically speaking, within this metaphor, obviously we, the church, are the salt of the earth, and the meat would be indicative of the world. And we can ask ourselves a question: is the meat going bad? And I think the obvious answer is yes. We turn on any social media outlet, any platform, the meat's going bad. But note what he's saying here and what he's getting at. Suppose you keep taking salt and applying it to meat, but you find that the meat that you apply it to keeps going bad. No matter what type of meat it is, no matter the size of the meat, it keeps going bad, it keeps spoiling, and it's not preserved 1 minute longer. So what Christ is essentially getting at is that at some point, you have to step back and stop asking what's wrong with the meat. And there's going to be a point in time where you step back and ask yourself what's wrong with the salt. And he's basically asking us to reevaluate the way we are and engage in our culture. Are we being salty? And there's a difference in this culture. If we say someone's being a salty Christian, that can have a different connotation, but that's another sermon. But he's saying the purpose of the salt itself. Now, with this in mind, for the sake of time, and I keep a large jug of water. People always point that out. I have ADHD, so I tend to talk fast and my mouth dries up because of my medicine. So having water on hand keeps me from getting cotton mouth. Now, one more verse actually to point to. Colossians chapter 4, verse 5 and 6. It says, be wise in the way you act towards outsiders, making the most of every opportunity, and let your conversation be always full of grace and seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Now, something to point out there really quick, because what I want to talk about in a nutshell is how we respond to what the Bible is going to call strongholds in our culture, how to be better witnesses and understanding these things. But in the verse we just read, it talked about having your speech itself seasoned with salt. How can we preserve our speech? How can we make the most out of every opportunity with outsiders? Because we don't always have, may not see them every day all the time. But two things to be said here. One is, it says, let your speech be seasoned with salt so you may know how to answer everyone. Note the verse says how to answer, not necessarily what to answer. In other words, I find it much more important that we need to learn how to respond to people and not necessarily have a cookie cutter answer for every question people give us. So if someone were to come to me and say, Eric, which this happens all the time, Eric, someone just said this, how do I respond? And what they're looking for is almost like a script. And that's the one thing I want to get people away from. We're not giving you a script. What we're doing is showing you many times it's important not necessarily to answer the question, but maybe to answer the person behind the question and maybe even question the question. So for example, if someone were to ask, let's say I were to ask a random student, hey, excuse me, can I ask you a question? Have you stopped beating your wife? Yes or no? Well, if they say yes, which I've had people say, yes, I have. And I say, oh, what's your wife's name? Well, I'm not married. Well, why would you say yes? And they say, well, because I don't beat my wife. And, well, you're not married, right? You don't have a wife, right? So the answer is not yes or no. The answer is, well, I don't have a wife. In other words, the very question itself doesn't apply to my situation. So for you to ask me to give an answer of yes or no insinuates that the very question applies to me when it doesn't. So in this instance, it's not necessarily here's what you answer, but here's how you answer. Now, with all that in mind, and I'm going through it kind of fast, 2 Corinthians chapter, we'll start at verse 4, and it reads, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4. In this passage is talking about spiritual warfare. And it says that the weapons that we fight with are not weapons of the world. On the contrary, they're not physical weapons. They have divine power to demolish strongholds. Now, if we stop there, we're told that with regards to spiritual warfare, the purpose here is what we do within spiritual warfare in this context is we are to demolish strongholds as believers. Well, then the question naturally arises, what is a stronghold? Well, it's defined in the very next verse. In verse 5, it says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Now, here's what's interesting. And other translations may even unpack it a little more. I think the Amplified even says assumptions, philosophies, presuppositions, which basically means within this passage, biblically speaking, this context says that spiritual warfare is first and foremost weapons that we have that are used to demolish strongholds. And then it defines strongholds as argumentations, reasonings, philosophies, presuppositions, things that go against the knowledge of God and are hindering people to coming to knowledge of God or a deeper knowledge of God. So literally, biblically speaking, this is telling us that if we want to be effective in evangelism, if we want to be effective in discipleship, if we want to be effective in spiritual warfare, then we cannot do this, biblically speaking, without apologetics. And I tell people, if you don't like that, you'd have to take it up with the author. I didn't write the book, I just read it. And in this context, it's telling us that within spiritual warfare, our job is quite literally to demolish strongholds, and we've defined what strongholds are. Now, this is where I think some people may have a misunderstanding where they think, oh, then we just argue with people and destroy the person. It doesn't say destroy the person, it says destroy the stronghold. Some translations say pull down the stronghold. Strongholds were like fortresses that would present barriers. And oftentimes there are barriers people have to the gospel. And again, for the sake of time, because there's a lot I can go into, let me just touch on 3 of the major strongholds within our culture and give responses to those, and then I'll let you guys ask questions. So there's 3 major strongholds. The first would be something like what's called relativism or subjectivism. And basically it's the view that there is no truth. And we see this playing out various ways in our culture, in our society, in our media, where people might say something like, well, I know you're against same-sex marriage, but that's fine if you are, because that's your truth. But don't tell someone else they can't have an abortion or have a same-sex marriage. If you're against it, then don't have one, but don't tell someone else they can't have one. You shouldn't impose your religious views onto other people, or there should be this separation of church and state. So you shouldn't bring your religious views when to the voting polls, or things of that nature, where it's this assumption that truth is so relative and subjective that no one knows it because there's nothing to be known, and you have to respect and tolerate everyone's position as equal. One way this might play out is, suppose I had a podium right here in front of me, and I said that there's somebody to the right of the podium, and that person might say, from his perspective, well, actually, from my perspective, you're to the left of the podium. Well, who's right and who's wrong? And the answer is, well, we're both right, and it's just relative, hence relativism, relative to your perspective of where you're looking at the podium. From my perspective, you're at the right. From your perspective, I'm at the left. So that's relative. The other two, then I'll give brief responses to them. The second one would be what's called scientism. There's an ism at the end, scientism, and it's the view that the only or perhaps best way to gain knowledge about reality is through science, which would basically come out in something like, if you cannot give me scientific evidence for something, then I have no reason to believe it, or that I can only believe what science tells me. And whatever the reason, and there are reasons I don't have time to get into, we put this stronghold puts science on a pedestal as if it is the arbiter of knowledge and truth. And so you have science on the one hand. If you want to know why some tragedy happened, why something happened, the news reporter will go to the scientist and say, Dr. Scientist, Mr. Double PhD so-and-so with the white lab coat, there's blue bubbles boiling in the background, so he's legit. Why did this happen? And he would say, well, in my expert opinion, we have empirical data that points us to yada, yada, yada. And then they go to the next room and say, Pastor Johnny come lately, tell us, how do you really feel about this in your heart, deep down inside? And he'll say, well, I strongly, really, truly, with all my heart and soul, really believe. And he pounds the podium a few times, which means, that he's really telling the truth if he pounds the podium. And if he really wants you to believe it, pounds a little harder, may hoop a little bit. And it's pitted as if you want knowledge, you go to science. But if you want your feelings kind of swayed, if you want to just give your oh, that's cute opinion, you go to religion, or you go to these kind of things that just, let's just kumbaya express ourselves, but let's not go as far as to say we're talking truth here. We're just giving our opinion, because science is the only way or the best way to gain knowledge. Now, the last one hits more home for me, and it's called naturalism. Naturalism, and in a nutshell, it is basically the view that the physical or the natural world is all there is, nothing more, nothing less, which means all that exists is things that are physical, things that are tangible, things that are empirical, nothing more, nothing less. And here's why it hits home for me. Freshman year of college, I took my first philosophy class. Later came to find my professor was an atheist. Second semester, I wanted to take another class, and I later learned, well, I knew my professor was an atheist. In fact, they warned me with this class, don't take his class, you might lose your faith. Where I was kind of excited and said, sign me up, not because I wanted to lose my faith, but because I knew enough to know that if Christianity were true, I needed to know why. But I also knew that if it were false, I still needed to know why, and this guy might be the guy for the job. The pivotal day in class that really changed everything for me was when he walks in one day and he pretends like he's holding up an antidepressant pill. And he says, religion wants us to believe in something like a soul. And it's because of the soul that we can have hope in an afterlife and see our family and friends that have passed away. He says, and something like Christianity would have you believe that your thoughts, your moods, your emotions, and your feelings are all in your soul, which is allegedly immaterial. It's something non-physical. And he said, but here's a problem. If I took this antidepressant pill, it's physical, but my soul is supposedly immaterial. And how is it that if I took this antidepressant pill, it has the power to change the thoughts and emotions and feelings and moods within my immaterial soul? How do we explain that? Then he said, because every time we look at the brain, we just see neurons firing. And every time we look at the body, we just see the chemicals, base elements of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, but you never find anything like a soul. How do we explain that? And he said, well, it's quite simple. I'll tell you how you explain it. He says, the answer is that there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no soul, there is no afterlife. We're just a physical brain and body, and there's nothing more to us than that. And we need to live with this fact and move on with our lives and stop believing in foolish fairy tales. Class dismissed. Now, how would you respond to something like that? How would you respond to such a stronghold? Because not only had I never met anyone that didn't believe in the soul, I had never heard an argument given against it. And for the first time in my life, I hear something that, if true, would mean that Christianity was false. Why do I say that? Up to that point, I heard a lot of complaints against Christianity, which really that's all they were, which might lean more into the first stronghold of relativism. Well, I don't think God should have done that. One atheist the other day told me, well, I think God should have done this. And I said, well, you believe God's omniscient, right? He said, yes, God knows everything, if he did exist. And I say, and you don't know everything. Right. I said, so you're telling me that you think a being that knows everything should do what you, a being who doesn't know everything, wants him to do. I said, something sounds off about that. But if this were true, Christianity would be false. Why? Because Paul said, if Christ had not been raised from the dead and there is no resurrection, then Paul himself says our faith is in vain and people should feel sorry for us. And basically, if there is no resurrection, Christianity is false. By the same token, if there's no soul, there can be no resurrection, and thus Christianity would be false. Now, those are the three strongholds in a nutshell. And let me just give a brief response to each one of them. And they can play out differently, and there are other types of strongholds or variations of them. But let's go with the first one, relativism or subjectivism, where people say there is no truth, or let's say I'm witnessing to someone who's a Buddhist, and I give them the gospel, and they say, that's great. And I say, well, do you believe this? Yeah. So you believe Christ, the Son of God? Yeah. I said, well, would you like to accept him in your heart? He says, oh, well, no, because I'm a Buddhist. I said, well, wait a minute. How can you believe that what I said is true and yet still be a Buddhist? Well, because I believe that's your truth, but my truth is something different. So basically, it's not that they reject it. It's that they just don't accept it as their truth. I had someone once say, Eric, there is no truth. And the short and easy answer is to just ask them a question. Is that true? Because if you tell me there is no truth and you say that statement as if what you're saying is true, then by your own definition, the very statement there is no truth can't be true. One time I was on a secular radio show, and they invited me on to talk about what I do. And before I even got 10 minutes into my presentation, people started calling. One person called, and as soon as they picked up the phone, the guy said, who are you to tell people they're wrong? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I'm fine with you saying you believe in God, but then you said Christianity is true. Are you implying that every other religion is wrong? And I said, well, yeah, that's how it works. 1 + 1 equals what? There's only one answer. It's not 2.1 or 1.9. There's one answer. And if you don't have that one answer, every other answer is wrong. I said, so yeah, if Christianity is true, everything's wrong. He says, well, who are you to tell people they're wrong? So I saw where he was going. And for the sake of time, this goes back to making the most out of every opportunity. I said, well, let me ask you the question. I said, it seems like you're telling me that I shouldn't tell people that they're wrong. Are you saying it's wrong to do that? He said, yes. I said, okay. I said, well, then could I just ask you the question, why are you calling me on live public radio to tell me that I'm wrong if you think it's wrong to tell people that they're wrong? Right. And it kind of clicked for him. And again, there's various ways that can be hashed out. Even with morality, don't impose your morality on me. And lots to say about that. But if you think about it, they're saying it's not moral to impose your moral views on someone else. Well, wait a minute. If you think it's immoral to impose your moral views on someone else, then why are you imposing that moral view, that namely it's immoral to impose your views on someone else? Why are you imposing that onto me? If it's wrong to impose your morals, then stop imposing your moral view that it's wrong to impose your moral views on someone else. You're imposing that on me, so it's self-defeating. The scientism, really quick. Someone once asked me, can you give me scientific evidence for God? And I said, why would I want to do a silly thing like that? And here's why I say that. God, if he existed, and obviously we're Christians, we believe he does. And I would say God, if he existed, is by definition a non-physical entity. right? Science, while it is a wonderful tool for studying the physical world, is a discipline that is limited to studying only the physical. So if science can only study the physical world, and God by definition is a non-physical entity, then you cannot use a discipline like science to try and investigate the non-physical. That is a category fallacy. It's like saying, I'm going to measure my weight and I grab a ruler. You don't use a ruler to measure your weight because it's the wrong tool for the assessment. Lot more to say there, but running out of time here. Naturalism, I'll just tackle that one real quick. And I want to say this too, and then I'll be done, is these strongholds have even crept into our church and we haven't even realized that. And here's how. Go to relativism, where there's no truth. There's a place for this. When I was in youth group, we did this probably more often than we should have, but where, we grab the Bible, and they say, okay, open your Bible and go to a random passage, read it out loud and tell me, what does this mean to you? As if the text itself has no objective meaning, and as if Paul himself didn't know what he was trying to convey. And rather than learn about the context and situation, kind of like what we did about Matthew 5:13 being the salt, instead we impose our presuppositions and our cultural norms onto the text instead of letting the text speak to us. But going to naturalism, I usually do this, and I like you guys, so I won't ask you the trick question, but I'll ask the trick question. Can you point to what part of your body thinks? And most of the time people do this. They point to their head. And I say, okay, brain. Then I ask, so do you need a brain to think? And people say yes. Okay. So you need a brain to think. Your brain is what thinks. And then I ask them, does God have a brain? And people usually get quiet. And I say, well, no, God doesn't have a brain because we're not Mormons. We don't believe God has a physical body. But God doesn't have a brain, but does he think? The psalmist says that his thoughts towards me are more than the grains of sand. He's crazy about me. He thinks about me. So God doesn't have a brain, thinks just fine. But you say we need a brain to think. But aren't we made in his image? And what I'm getting at here is that how is it that we live in a culture, in a society that wants to reduce everything to something physical? And, they want to be neutral. So let's not bring soul or spirit into the conversation. Let's just say it's your brain that thinks, because we know that when you think, there's chemical electro activity in the brain. So let's say it's your brain that thinks, and be neutral. That's not being neutral. That's naturalism. But we're taught and told that it's your brain that thinks. And we learn this. And then we go to church Sunday morning and we worship a God that has no brain and thinks just fine. And we never let these two beliefs come together. And we begin to create our own strongholds by shooting ourselves in the foot, by not recognizing the strongholds that are within our culture that branch out into other ways and manifest in different ways and so forth. How do I respond to something like that? I'll say it in a minute or two. For naturalism. So I would argue that we are a soul. I don't have a soul. I am a soul that has a body, and a body without a soul is a corpse. So I have a body, but I don't have a soul. I am a soul. And then here's where I usually say that I've actually changed my position on this. I do have a soul. It's orange, and it's a Kia Soul, and it's sitting in my driveway. And I bought that car just so I can make that joke, and it's worth every penny every time I make it. Because I do have Kia Soul. So I am a soul that has a body, and within my soul, there are different faculties, components of my soul. One of the faculties of my soul is my mind. And basically, if what my professor is saying is true, if there's no soul, there's no God, then you reduce the mind to something physical like the brain. But we know that's not true. Why? Because there are things true of the brain and the states of the brain that are not true of the mind and states of the mind. Really quick, here's what I mean by that. If I take two clear fluids, I know one's water, I don't know what the other one is. Well, I just look at their properties. Do they share the same properties? Well, let's suppose I turn over the bottle that's not labeled, but on the back I see it says constant flammable. And I think, well, I know water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what this chemical is, I know it's not water because water's not flammable, this one is. So they have different properties. Take that same concept and apply it to the brain and the mind. I'll give you 3 examples and I'll be done. My thoughts can be true or false, but no part of my brain can be true or false. My brain can weigh 7 pounds, but the belief that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 7 pounds. My brain can be in a state that is 7 inches long, but the taste of a banana or the smell of a rose isn't 7 inches long, and that's in my mind. I can give many more examples, but the point is simple. If the properties of the brain are physical and the properties of the mind are not physical, then they can't be the same thing or reducible to each other, which means if consciousness exists, it can't be something physical, and naturalism can't be true. Again, lots more to say, and that one was a little bit more complicated, but that was more relative to my story. There's other ways of addressing it, but end of the day, we want to be the salt of the earth. We want to make the most of every opportunity. We want to have salt in our speech, and we want to know how to answer people, not necessarily what to tell or answer people. And of course, do this as Christ did. When doubting Thomas approached him, the first thing Christ did was not to hit him over the head. The first thing he said was not, blessed are those who don't see and believe. The first thing he did was give him what he was asking for. You want evidence? You want to see? Here it is. And if we want to be like Christ in a culture full of doubting Thomases, then let's be like Christ and expose and show the evidence that we have for the truth of our beliefs, that Christ rose from the dead and Christianity is true. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eric. Those are great strongholds to name for us, because I think we can see those so evident in our culture, and we, especially on our campuses, are dealing with a lot of those things very front and center each and every day. Even sometimes through the institutions themselves, those things are really put forward. So as we think about that, I just kind of to start us off with some questions, and Lee, you may have some questions also, but one of the questions that I wanted us to talk a little bit about is the who are you to tell me that this is true? Who are you? The claim of exclusivism has even been flagged, I know, on some of our campuses around the country as it's triggering and, hate speech, that you would tell somebody that you have an exclusive claim about God. So what are your thoughts on how do we answer that, particularly in the context of, you're assaulting me with your view?
Yeah, a great question. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's very relevant to, like you said, what we experience today, especially our young people in college. I think one of the best things to do in conversations is to ask questions as opposed to just merely making statements. You can even turn a statement into a question. So let's suppose I say that Christianity is the way to God, and they'll say like, well, that's no, you can't say that for whatever reason. And I would basically ask them, well, why do you think that's wrong to say? And then I might even, kind of turn the table. I say, well, what do you believe? And they might say something like, so for example, this happened. I was talking with a young lady who was Muslim, and she said, I'm Muslim, but I respect all religions. And she immediately said that after she said she was Muslim. And she says, each religion has her own truth. And she kind of had that mentality you were talking about. And I said, well, let me ask, in other words, instead of saying, well, no, you're wrong, I'm right. Instead of me expressing my views, I asked her about her views. I asked questions, and I said, well, so why are you a Muslim? Well, I grew up this way. That's how I was taught, which is sadly sometimes the only answer Christians give me when I ask them why you're a Christian. That's an entire another topic and story. And even personal testimonies. There's nothing wrong with testimonies. There's nothing wrong with testimonies. That's something I left out in my presentation, but the Bible says that the preaching of the cross is power to those who believe, but it's foolishness to those who don't. So how can we take what the world deems as foolishness and demonstrate the power? But setting that aside for right now, I said, so you're part of the Muslim community because you grew up that way. And then I asked, would you say that Islam is true? And she kind of paused as if she never thought about that. And again, I've had the same thing with Christians. Do you think Christianity is true? And they kind of pause. Well, the thoughts never crossed their mind. And she said, well, it's true for me. I said, okay. I said, well, let me ask you this. Do you recognize that Christianity and Islam have at many points radically different beliefs on certain topics, like who Jesus was? We believe he's the Messiah, was crucified. The Quran says he was not the Messiah, and he wasn't even crucified, much less rose from the dead. So she said, yeah. I said, okay, so would you say that they both cannot be true? She says, well, I'm not saying it's, I said, right, I know, I understand that, but let's just, take our own beliefs out. Could they both be true? One says this happened. One says this definitely did not happen. Can they both be true? She said, no. I said, okay. So regardless of our positions, I think we can say that one of us, or perhaps both of us, are wrong. And then she started like, well, yeah, I guess you could say that. And I said, okay. So I just got to the exclusivity part without having to argue it by instead asking questions and letting her come to that conclusion. And then if she wanted to take the conversation, we could have kept going. And of course, you read the situation. But notice there was no arguments. There was no going back and forth. There was no mudslinging. There's no, well, you're right, I'm wrong. I allowed her to come to that conclusion simply by asking the right questions.
That's good. Lee, do you have any questions that you'd like to put out?
Eric, I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little more about naturalism and unpack that a little more, especially as we're thinking through the physical, non-physical of the brain and the mind.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, so the area that I've specialized, I use that weekly, that I focus on most is the topic of the soul and consciousness. And basically, there's this temptation in our society and in the secular culture to reduce everything to something physical. And sometimes, again, I think we even see that in our churches, whether we realize it or not. And there, of course, there's the other extreme to where we reduce everything to something spiritual. So, for example, the latter, there's time, I'm sure we've all met someone where you're like, you're eating, and you see the other person got a certain item on the menu. You say, oh, hey, I noticed you got the new burger. How does it taste? And they say, you know what? This burger tastes great, but you know what's even better? The love of my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, from the Most High God. I'm like, dude, I just want to know how your burger is. Like, we're both Christians. You don't have to spiritualize everything. And of course, then there's the other extreme where everything's reduced to something physical, where like an atheist or a secular group might say, like studies have shown that when you pray and you feel like you're talking to God or you feel the presence of God, neuroscientists can actually show that it's nothing more than chemicals and neurons firing in your brain. If that's all they say, I notice a temptation for most people or Christians evangelizing is to want to respond and answer. But you can't answer a question that's not asked. Nothing was said there. So this goes back to the question thing. So I've had someone tell me that, and I say, okay. I said, sure, I agree. So what you're telling me is when I pray, I'm using my mind and my brain has neurons firing. Okay. Yeah. So far we're in agreement. And I say, go on. And they'll say, well, that just means that, when you're praying, these things are going out. So therefore, what does that show us? And then finally I have to pull it out of him. Okay. So it shows that you're not talking to God. It's just your brain firing. And I say, well, wait a minute. Are you assuming, and here you can go a different variety of ways. Are you assuming that when we pray, we should not use our brains? Are you saying it's possible to have thoughts without neurons firing? I don't, what are you saying here? And then sometimes they might just come out and say, well, it shows that if we can replicate that experience of God in the lab, then you're not really talking to God. And I'll say, well, let me ask you this. They've also done things where they're able to replicate a person's experience or memories by probing the brain or shocking it. And I could put you in a lab, put you under, and make you have a dream or an experience of being at the beach. Does it follow from this that therefore beaches don't exist, or that that you've never been to the beach? No, of course not. So just because I can replicate an experience doesn't mean that the experience in and of itself was never valid in the first place. So again, we shouldn't try and separate the physical from the immaterial necessarily, and we don't want to deny that. I have a long presentation on the soul, but basically I would argue that the mind is a capacity of the soul. And think of it like this, because the question is even brought about, what about the spirit? I would say that the spirit is also a faculty of the soul. It's like this. If I could ask a trick question, and I can say, when you taste lemonade, what taste? You or your taste buds? Now, it's a trick question because the answer is I'm tasting through my taste buds. Right? With no taste buds, I can't taste. When I pray, am I praying or is my spirit praying? Well, I, the soul, am praying through the faculty of my spirit. Now, in the same way, when I'm thinking, I'm using my mind, but my mind is correlated with a brain. Think of a musician, say a guitar player, piano player. If if you were to damage my guitar or pop strings on my guitar, it would inhibit my ability to play the music, which means I can show that there is a correlation and a cause and effect relationship between myself and a guitar, but it doesn't follow that therefore I am a guitar, or that the notes that I'm playing are inside the guitar, and if I were to give it a good shake or break it, the note C would fall out on the floor. So just because there's a cause and effect relationship, it doesn't follow that they're the same thing or that one is in the other, any more than a cause and effect relationship between my mind and brain show that my thoughts are in my brain, or that my mind is nothing more than my brain. So there's a difference there, and it's significant because a big pushback I get is that, well, if you have brain damage or Alzheimer's, it affects your memory. And I say, go on. And they say, well, then there's no soul. I said, well, rewind. If you affect my brain, you can affect my memory. How did you get to therefore there's no soul? If I go downstairs and I break my Wi-Fi router, do I break the Wi-Fi, or do I break the router that utilizes and allows me access to the Wi-Fi? Oh, I break the router. I don't even know what it means to break Wi-Fi. How do I break Wi-Fi? I can break routers, but I can't break Wi-Fi. But does it mean that the Wi-Fi is in the router? No, there's a cause and effect or dependence relationship, and the same would apply to like our soul using our brain. While I'm in this body, I need a properly functioning instrument, much like the piano or guitar player needs a properly functioning instrument to play his music. Good question.
Yeah.
Do you have some a resource on that particular topic that you can recommend?
Yeah, to shamelessly plug, you can on my YouTube channel. I have a lot of discussions on these. I've even done debates on these. I have a 2.5 hour. I go in really in depth metaphysically. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy, for those who may not know listening, that deals with ultimate reality, the nature of things. And I go into the metaphysics of a soul for about 2.5 hours. A great scholarly book I would highly recommend is this one by J.P. Moreland called Body and Soul, Human Nature and the Crisis in Ethics. What I love about this book is that it not only goes through the arguments for the soul, like half the book is a good, relatively deep dive in metaphysics on the soul, and the other half of the book is how this applies to ethical issues, such as abortion, euthanasia, in vitro fertilization, cloning, things like this, that the technologies that are advancing. And let me say this too, the church has to stop being reactionary to the culture and has to start creating culture. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. In other words, we tend to react to what the culture does, but we don't tend to lead in what the culture does. It used to be that way, but now we're reacting, not being the leaders in these areas. Let me just go ahead and say this and come out clean and say, I'm going to be honest. I don't know y'all's opinion, but most Christian movies I've watched are horrible. They're not good. Bad acting, cheesy. I mean, it's just like, oh my gosh, the atheist is always angry and he just has to get saved right before he dies at the end of the movie. I mean, hey, show an atheist that doesn't get saved at the end of the movie, because it happens. You know, we shouldn't sugar. Anyways, I'm sorry. I sound like a grumpy old man. My point is, now, why is this? Because the church, you know, maybe at first saw this as, well, that's of the world. Let's not do that's worldly. And now we're like, oh, well, maybe it's not so bad. Let's use it for the cause of Christ. A little bit late to the party. Now we're playing catch up. We're reacting, not creating. So back to this with the soul issue, technology like cloning, in vitro fertilization, you know, when artificial insemination, euthanasia, abortion, these are issues that the culture has been talking about for a long time. And it's almost as if the church is barely starting to talk about that. Now, abortion may be a little bit different, but something like euthanasia and in vitro fertilization, these are technologies that are developing. And the question is, I did a talk yesterday on Zoom in Finland, and we were talking about, I did a whole talk on the soul. One of the questions was, well, when does the soul enter your body? Long story, but or complicated rather, but basically at conception, you have a new human being at conception. Without getting into the metaphysics here, some people would argue, well, at a certain point in time, the unborn child is not conscious, so they're not human persons. They're not persons. Well, the question is a metaphysical question that begs the question of what is a person? How do we define a person? That's one of my arguments for the soul. I'll give it really quick. Being a person is a property that is what's called, philosophers call a non-degreed property. What does that mean? A degreed property is something like being loud or hard. Something can be louder or softer, which means these are properties that can fluctuate. They can go up or down. Non-degreed properties are properties that are all or nothing. There's no in between. So for example, the property of being even, evenness, the number 2 and the number 6 are both even, but it makes no sense to say that the number 6 is more even than the number 2 because evenness is not a degreed property. Now, personhood is a property, and the question is it degreed or is it non-degreed? Well, depends. Are you just a brain and body, or are you something more like an immaterial soul? Well, if I am just a brain and body, I'm a purely physical object. Well, we know purely physical objects can exist in degrees. What do I mean by that? If you were to chop off my arms and legs, it makes sense to say I have 50% of a body, but it doesn't make sense to say I'm 50% of a person, which means while I can have 50% of a body, I don't have 50% personhood because personhood is an all or nothing kind of thing. It's not a degreed property. Men are typically larger than women, but it doesn't mean that men have more value or are more persons than women. And here's another thing. Being sensitive and cognizant of the culture, we can use some of the culture issues within our presentations and arguments. You know, there's a big push for equality, right? You know, you're going to get crucified if you say men are better at anything than women or whatever the case is, depending on what college you go to. So I use this. Are men better than women? No, of course not. Okay, great. Well, that means having more mass and matter doesn't mean you matter more. And if having more mass and matter doesn't give you value, then apparently your personhood isn't grounded in your body. It's grounded in something that transcends the body, namely the soul. If you have no soul, then you can't say that everyone's equal because everyone doesn't have the same amount of mass and matter. But if mass and matter isn't what counts, then there's something more than that, namely your soul. With the abortion issue, going to the consciousness thing. Okay, yeah, but they're not conscious. Well, the soul is what grounds your capacity for consciousness. Here's what I mean by that. And you don't even have to go into the soul. You don't even have to go this deep. But basically, take a person in a coma. A person in a coma isn't conscious, but they're still persons, and as persons have the capacity to be conscious. So while the unborn in a certain period isn't conscious, it doesn't mean that they won't become conscious if we allow them to develop. An acorn can become an oak tree, even if it's never planted in the ground. In other words, not actualizing the capacity doesn't make it cease to be what it is. So if an unborn child isn't conscious, but if they're persons, and if persons by their very nature have the capacities to become conscious, then that's all that matters. I can speak English. I can speak Spanish. I can't speak French, but I have the capacity to develop the capacity to speak French. The unborn child at a certain stage may not be conscious, but they have all that they need to develop their capacity that's already latent within them to become conscious. Therefore, they're human, whether consciousness is actualized or not. Again, that's a little bit more technical than you know, maybe it should have been or could have been, and there's a lot easier ways to say that, but just to kind of, you know, throw it out there and show how these can be intricately woven in and dealt with. And I think, again, you know, the church really has to stop being reactionary and playing catch up and start leading the way in these issues and areas.
So just a follow-up question to that. If you were to say, you know, we're engaging with and investing in the leaders, not of tomorrow necessarily. I mean, they're leaving colleges and going out into the workforce and into the world in a lot of places. What kind of things do you think, if you were to say to some of those young leaders, here's a way that you can help create culture, here's a way that you can help lead in our culture, what are some tangible ways you see them doing that?
Yeah, great question. It's going to be different for everyone. But as scripture says, whatever you do, do it as you're doing it unto the Lord. When you, first and foremost, do things with excellence. Do things knowing that people are watching you. You know, you want to be a representation of Christ. I think what was Gandhi said, you know, I like Christ, but it's the Christians that I kind of have problems with. And he said, you know, I probably would have become a Christian had I ever truly met one. Now, of course, the irony is he met lots of Christians, but in his mind, they weren't acting like Christ. That's one thing to say. Another thing to say is, first and foremost, do what God has called you to do. Do it well, as I already said, but also recognize that what you're doing can and will have some implications in the long run. Here's what I mean by that. Growing up, some of the churches I went to, the perception was like the highest calling is to become a pastor or an evangelist or a preacher, right? But let's suppose you had someone in the audience who maybe felt called to be a book writer or a movie producer or a scientist. And, we'd go to these youth camps and like, okay, we're having a night where, if you feel called to ministry, come now. And of course, people who came to the front, there may be even some egoism going on there of, oh, I'm called to ministry. And the people sitting in the pews are kind of like, well, I'm not called to ministry. It's almost like we're putting them on a pedestal. I tell people the highest calling isn't necessarily to be a pastor, an evangelist, or a minister. That's great. The highest calling for your life is whatever God has called you to do. Because I dare say there are some people who have taken on the call of perhaps being a pastor or evangelist who probably didn't get that phone call. And I won't tell you who. Once we log off, I'll tell you. I'm just joking. And what I'm saying is, first and foremost, see whatever you're doing as something that God has created you and intended for you to do. Do it well, and in that you can give God glory. Look at Lord of the Rings. Look at the great. He was such a great writer. The way he expressed things, and there's biblical messages to it. There's Christian metaphors within it, and he was open about that. And look how much of an impact it's had on our culture. Look at someone like C.S. Lewis, great writer. And the things that he would do and write, we still study today. So when we look at these people who were writing in poetry, were very influential in what they did. You look at some of the scientists like Francis Collin, who was part of the Human Genome Project, considered like the father of the Human Genome Project, discovering human DNA and unpacking that. He's a believer. Wasn't always a believer. Was an atheist at first. People who we can point to. People I would love to see, and I'm dreaming big here, where we can, in all of our churches, have leaders, perhaps even lay leaders at first, or whatever we need in certain areas. This person's going to specialize in this scientific field, or he's going for a degree. Let's pray for him. Let's encourage him. Let's lay hands on him. So when he becomes, whatever he's doing in his vocation, we can turn to him and ask him about his expertise on this topic. When it comes to things like cloning, in vitro fertilization, abortion, neuroscience. I have friends of mine who, they had mothers with Alzheimer's. Is it still the same person? How do we treat them? Are they still, they're acting different? Are they, is something happening to their salvation? How is this going to look like in the afterlife? These are questions we cannot ignore, and we need to lead in these areas. And if we have young people who are called to, whether it be theater, movie, book writing, whatever the case, journalism. My goodness, we need Christian journalists out there. We need people who are going to stand up and utilize the ethics of Christ in what they do, glorify God in what they do, and be able to help others in those areas of whatever it is that they've been called to. So I know it's more of a vague answer because it's going to apply differently to everyone, but my goodness, the person who's doing surgery, can help people who may need that, but the person who's doing neuroscience and, therapy and psychology can help believers in those ways as well. Whether you're writing books, please, my gosh, please, let God raise up some movie producers that are God-believing Christians. And we've seen some good Christian movies. Again, I'm gonna leave it there because I'm gonna start ranting again. But yeah, we need a lot more believers who are God-fearing, Spirit-filled believers, leading the way in many, if not all, these areas.
So true. Yeah. And I think it's a real challenge for those who, it's a challenge for our student leaders, of course, to engage in those places and to not leave behind their faith because they're going into a particular field. I think of medicine, so many are really challenged when they go into that field. Their faith is really challenged. But we need good folks, Christian folks who are serving in that area. I think it's also a challenge for those of us who lead students that we help ask those kind of questions and help them think about how are they going to walk forward into their field of career choice in faith. How are they going to take those things into faith, and how can they be best prepared to be strong in their faith as they go into those different fields. So
Yeah, and when we ignore and try to separate our quote faith, Christianity, and our vocation, that's when we see strongholds creeping in, going unnoticed. You know, like the whole. I mean, I was talking to someone who's a professor, won't mention the name, or what school, who teaches fine arts, and we were talking, and I'm trying to say this without revealing anything, but basically, there was 4 choices of which of these is not art. It was like car, sunrise, pottery, and a painting. And I said, well, I think the car probably wouldn't be considered art. And they're like, oh no, it's actually sunrise, because the definition of art is to be created. It has to be created by a person. And they said the other things are created by a person. A sunrise wasn't. I said, wait a minute, you're a Christian. You're a Christian professor. God is a person, not a human person, but he is a divine person. So the sunrise would still be created by a person. And then his response was, well, I don't know if I can see God as a person. I'm thinking, whoa, pump the brakes. That's some bad metaphysics there. What is a person? People equivocate and confuse person with human. God is a person. He's 3 persons. He's one God, but he's 3 persons, but he's not a human person, but he is still a person. And I think that's in part what it means to be made in God's image. But here's where you have this separation of beliefs and vocations, where there's not an integration of whatever the person does in their faith. We can lead in these areas, utilizing the teachings of Christ and what he taught us, and learning, being good stewards. The greatest commandment, in my opinion, is one of the best verses for apologetics, because it says to love God with your heart, mind, soul, and strength. I think the church does a fair job of loving God with our strength. We volunteer, right? We help out. I think the church does a fair job of loving God with our hearts. We get emotional. That's good. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with emotions. But then there's loving God with the mind. In the past 100 years or so, I think the modern day, especially American church, has really dropped the ball there. And that's why I tell people, whether you're lifting your hands or lifting up a book, you're fulfilling the greatest commandment in loving God with all that you are. And we need to get back to that. Not just focus on 1 or 2, but focus on all 3 and holistically give God everything that we are.
yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Eric, for your time today. And we really appreciate you being with us. If folks want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, you can reach out to me. You can just shoot me an email, Eric, ERIC.Hernandez @txb.org. That's Eric, ERIC.Hernandez @txb.org. You can look at my YouTube channel. I upload videos sporadically, debates, lectures, or talks that I've given, even discussions, even some in-house discussions, some good, honest, laid-back conversations I've had with atheists, and you can really see kind of light bulbs going off, which is great to see. They let me pray with them at the end. So yeah, shoot me an email, or check out my YouTube channel. Yeah, I would love to chat with you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you guys for having me. I appreciate that.